Says, I hear you identify as Latina, and asked if I identify as a woman of color. And it was the first time that anyone had ever asked me instead of making their own assumptions. And somehow, wait, here's the thing though, I'm not just white, and I'm not just Hispanic or Latino, right? But somehow, I have never been white enough, and I have never been Mexican enough. I have lived my whole life being told that I'm not enough. And though I am both cultures, I have never belonged to either. All right, so that is my story in brief. Like, obviously, it doesn't cover every aspect of my life. Some other pieces that I think are important are that, like, my family is kind of a blended family. Like, my stepdad is an African-American man, and my youngest brother is half Black. And so, like, I became very passionate about racial justice, just because I don't think it's right that other people that are darker than me have to go through some of the things they have to go through just because of their skin color. And so for the purpose of this conversation, I will probably be using race and ethnicity interchangeably. And I think it's good to start with some definitions, because race is a group of people sharing the same culture, history, language, etc., or is also known as an ethnic group. Ethnicity is the fact or state of belonging to a social group that has a common national or cultural tradition. Here's the fun fact. Latino or Latinx or Hispanic is not considered a race, it's considered an ethnicity only. But also keep in mind that race is a socially constructed thing. I have a brain fart. Okay. And so, like, I was doing some research. I'm like, where's the backing for this, like, Hispanic being a race or not being a race? And I found this article and I pulled these two quotes from it because I thought they were pretty useful in my mind. So federal policy defines Hispanic not as a race, but as an ethnicity, and it prescribes that Hispanics can in fact be of any race, which is true. If you think about the ancestry of Latin America, it is typically European descent of some sort mixed with the African slaves that were brought over to those colonies, mixed with the indigenous people of that land, and there's even some Asian ancestry that falls into there as well. So yeah, we can be anything, right? And that is why we come in all shades. As a new Pew Research Center survey of multiracial Americans finds that for 2/3 of Hispanics, so 66% of Hispanics, their Hispanic background is part of their racial background, not something separate. So I very much view my Latinidad as my race, right? But it's not a race. And so doctors get really mad when I go to the office and I'm like filling out my paperwork and I'm like, there's that box again. And I'm like, I'm not checking that box, I'm checking other. Because I don't define myself as white or Black, so I'm other, right? And I just write human, and they don't really like that a whole lot. But oh well, they'll get used to it. And so I think it's important for us to talk about perceptions as well, because perceptions are projections, right? So they are your projections of how somebody else is, how you perceive them to be. So Trudy V, we're gonna go with, says perception equals projection. The way that you view people is the way that you will treat them. And I think that's so true in society. If we think about people, I'm gonna hold that for later because we're gonna talk about that later. But we do treat people how we view them, right? And what perceptions we make of them. And then I like this quote from Rachel as well. We can't control the filters that others choose to look at us through, because that's not something that any of us in this room have control over, right? So I think it's important for us to talk about, because perceptions bring up biases, whether they are conscious or unconscious, right? And so this is kind of where the "you're going to participate" part comes in. So I pose to you, like, why are perceptions important for us to talk about in relation to students, colleagues, peers, friends, any sort of person that you know of mixed backgrounds?
I think it just comes down to the fact that you can't always identify anything just by using your eyes. And then the assumptions can really be damaging, as you kind of cited in your monologue. And so being able to dialogue, being able to ask questions, being able to clarify and have some of that self-authorship and self-advocacy is really, really important, especially with college students.
Thank you. What else?
I think a lot of times going off of that, our perceptions are often wrong, and like our first impressions are often wrong because we only have like one narrative, or only have one side of background.
Yeah, thank you. So if you didn't know me before today and you walked in this room, you probably made a snap judgment of like, oh, this is Kira, these are her identities, because you knew my name from the presentation, like, outline, right? But whenever we come into contact with someone for the first time, or if we're passing someone on the street, we kind of make some snap judgments about them. That doesn't mean that they're right, but we go on believing that it's true, and it's not necessarily true. And so, like, this isn't just relatable to mixed ethnicity people, right? This is for people that we walk past the street and we infer their gender, we infer their sexual identities. And so I think it's just something to continue to think about. If you don't have thoughts or you don't feel like sharing today, continue to think about that. All right, and so, like, the forgotten, right? Tying it back to the theme, I think it's from seeing Dr. Tracy West on Monday, like, she sparked some things in me, right? Like, I was like, Christy, who was my supervisor, I was like, yeah, like, she just reminded me of some things that I need to add to my presentation. And I was so pumped. She said something about, next thing you know, they'll be trying to date our children. As one of the cases of a high school student that was trying to attend a school that was no longer going to be segregated for the first time, when a parent approached them and spit in their face. So it's that concept of inbreeding is not something that we agree with. It's this, yeah, it's profound to me, because it's like that still happens today. Like the bus driver telling me that mixed kids are messed up and don't know what they are. It's tying that back to me. I'm like, that relates so much to experiences that I've had, and speaking with other people that come from multiple identity backgrounds that they have also experienced, or just being a confusing person to the world. Like, what do you mean you're these two things? Like, so, and then that brought me to the loving family, which is basically like the first, well, not the first interracial couple, definitely not, but the Lovings are a family that are kind of like historical. That their plight was during the civil rights movement, and they got married in 1958, and then a little while later, their home was invaded. They were both arrested and sentenced to 25 years to prison because they were unlawfully wed, because marrying outside of your race was not allowed. It was illegal, right? So, like, sometimes I'm like, oh, I might not be here today if it wasn't for this family. Like, they made movements. And so, like, they took it to court in 1963. The judge vetoed it, said, no, you still can't. You can't be married. You should move away. You should go somewhere else. So they spent their life living their marriage in secrecy, kind of like off the grid, and trying not to draw attention to themselves. But they took their case back to the Supreme Court in 1967, where the judge ruled it unconstitutional to ban people from being able to marry each other based on their race. And I also wanted to bring up the one-drop rule, which is basically that if you have 1 drop of black blood in you, you are considered black. And it's a very old, outdated rule. But at one point in time, I couldn't find any articles saying whether or not it was still like in place or not. But I think I went to a presentation that talked about this, and it is still legal in some states. They still say, like, hey, you got 1 drop of African American blood or ancestry in your lineage, and therefore you are black. And so it says that racially mixed persons are assigned the status of the subordinate group. So my mom telling me to hit the Hispanic box, that was her like falling into the 1 drop rule. And so, like, though this rule is technically designated towards people of African descent, it has crossed over into other ethnicities as well. And we see that more commonly in the Native American culture, where you have to be 1/8% Native American in order to be considered a member of the tribe. So, yes. And then moving on to complexities. I think there are a lot of things that we need to think about when we are talking about being part of one or more race, right? Or 2 or more races or ethnicities. And that is, depending on the person, you might have an oppressed identity and a privileged identity. So for me, I view the Latinness I view my Mexicanness as like part of my race, because brown people are treated differently. And so having that oppressed identity is something that I grew up like seeing, and not necessarily even realizing that I had the privilege identities in my whiteness and in my skin appearance. And it wasn't really something that I started exploring was my privilege. I didn't start exploring that until grad school. And I had an emotional breakdown and a midlife crisis because I was like, what do you mean I have privilege? And so I think depending on the student, they're gonna look at that differently, right? They might identify very strongly with their privileged identity. They might identify very strongly with their marginalized identity. They might not know what oppression looks like. They might not know what their privilege looks like. And it's a very complex thing because it's gonna be different. And if you're part of 2 subordinate groups, which of those groups are you? Which one's your superior one and which one's your subordinate one? So how do you identify? Do you identify as mixed? So there's a lot that goes into that. And again, like belonging versus feeling isolated. Some people have families that are wonderful and are like, yeah, we accept you, you are part of our family. Some people have experiences like mine where people are like, you're not fully one of us. On either side. And so, like, they can feel like they belong to their race or their ethnic background based on their family dynamics, based on their peer group, but they can also be very isolated because they could be seen as not being enough. And so, like, it's a real thing, and it's something that not all people understand. And so, I think that kind of goes into my passing and code switching. How many of you are familiar with these terms? Okay, so for passing, have any of you seen Munoz, If These Halls Could Talk? Okay, no. So Munoz is, if you have a chance to watch that film, I would highly suggest it. It's great. But he took a bunch of college students from different backgrounds and sat them all together in a room and had them have conversations about race. And there was a Puerto Rican woman in this group, and she had made a comment about like, man, sometimes people say things to me and or say things around me, and I have to decide whether I'm gonna pass or not. So are you gonna pass on addressing that situation, or are you gonna pass on, like, today I'm bringing forward white Kira, today I'm bringing forward Mexican Kira, right? So like what you're trying to pass yourself off in as to fit in. And so code switching, I do it every day of my life to fit in to American standard of professionalism. And so it's like when you're home or when you're with your one group of friends or your one side of the family and you're talking the way that you normally would at home, which for me, I grew up in what was known as the hood. Racine has been featured on Gangland. That's my home. Not that I'm proud of it. But so like how I talk to my friends back home is more slang, not rural, but like more like Ebonic based. And that's not something that I can do in my professional field. So like I put on like my professional, like, hello. When I'm around my dad's side of the family, I definitely have an accent. And so we switch to adapt to whatever situation we're in and whichever situation we feel, or whichever like voice or presentation of ourselves we feel is gonna be best perceived by our audience, right? And again, tying back into perceptions. And then language. So I think it's important for us to talk about language because, sorry about that, we often try to label people based off of our first impressions, right? So I know a lot of people, when they first see me, they're like, oh, you're white. Other people are like, oh, you're Latina. And I'm like, well, I'm both. And some people identify as mixed. Some people don't identify as mixed. I was working with a couple of RAs at my last job, and we were having a conversation about how we identify. And one of my RAs said, like, well, I'm mixed, and I'm part white and I'm part black, but I really hate the term black. She's like, I don't feel like that defines me. And she's like, I also don't like the term African American because I don't feel like that best suits me, right? And so my other RA comes up to me and she's like, Kara, like, how do I ask her like what she identifies? Like, I want to make sure that I'm referring to her properly. And so I had to challenge this RA to like, it's okay to ask about race. Like, it is okay to ask how people identify, so that you are being correct and not making your own assumptions. But also challenging her to think about like, in what context would you need to refer to her in that manner. But also thinking about some of our international students, right? So when our Bohemian students come over here, they don't know that they're black, right? In America, they're black. But that's not necessarily how they view themselves. And so I think instead of making those quick judgments and those assumptions, we need to start asking and having conversations and getting to know how people identify themselves. And also thinking about language and like what conversations you're having around people, because you could have someone that is white presenting and they might not be fully white, or they might not be white at all. And like I remember like being in the back seat of my friend's car. Her mom was visiting, and her mom started saying some like anti-Latin people sort of things. And mom didn't know what I was. And so I was like, Spooner girl, your mom, you might want to get her because I didn't appreciate that conversation. I don't want to hang out with her anymore. And so it's like conversations like that happen around me all the time because people don't understand that I'm more than what I might appear. And so just really being cognizant of those conversations, right? And then there's this word that I don't know. Oh, wait, no, role models. Like, we don't have a whole lot of role models that are like publicly out there. And for our parents, a lot of times, if they are like, my mom is fully white, my dad is fully Mexican, they don't understand my experience as a mixed person. And so sometimes it's hard having those people to talk to that can relate to you because they're not in our own families. And then this is the word that I don't know how to pronounce, but basically it's that prejudice that says mixed people, like, that shouldn't happen. Like, you should stick to your pure race. And then, so like that is a unique prejudice that mixed people get to face. Yay. And then race and ethnicity is only one of their intersectional identities. So that might not be the most prominent thing in that person's life. So like for me, for a while, like I didn't really think about race as a whole lot. I thought more about my size because I'm like, I'm the fat girl in the classroom. I'm getting teased on the playground. Like, I'm not making friends because they think I'm fat and smelly, right? And so, like, depending on where that person is at in their life, they might not think about race. And so, like, don't use that as, like, your only guiding principle. Again, it's important to have conversations with people. So then, again, this is kind of, if you want to talk at your table or pair up with a table nearby if you're by yourself. And I have a couple of questions that I want you to think about, and if we can share as a larger group in a couple minutes, that would be great. So how are we serving our biracial and multiracial students? Or if you are not in a capacity where you're working with students, maybe your friends or family members or other coworkers that you might have, in what ways might we, excuse me, in what ways might we be disservicing people with mixed identities? And then how are we interacting with people with multiple ethnic backgrounds? I'm gonna give you all about another minute. All right. I'd like to know, like, at least one thing from each table about what you talked about. We can start over here in the back. Thank you.
We talked a little bit about languages and how language sometimes is another one of those things that can be assumed, especially with biracial or multiracial students. Um, you know, virtually all of our classes are taught in English on our campuses, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's student's first language, their most comfortable language. Um, my conversation partner is EMT, and so about encountering language barriers there in healthcare.
Yeah.
And then we also talked a little bit about how students on this campus can make friends and how they kind of connect with people that don't necessarily look like them. Um, Whether you're a white student connecting with a more diverse population or the other way around.
Thank you. Table in the other side of the back. I was actually having a conversation with one of my RAs about that earlier, about how, like, it was a new concept for me when I had went away to college, and even when I moved back to the Midwest after being away for a little while, about how people smile at each other when you pass them walking down the street, right? Like, in my hometown, like, smiling meant weakness. And for some cultures, it's also like not a thing to smile all the time, right? So, yeah, and we were talking about, like, in Minnesota, like, you have to, like, walk in and you see someone and you have, hi, like, so, like, that is a cultural thing that you pick up when you are here. Thank you. Yeah.
We talked a lot about how a service, but also a disservice would be like our clubs that we use it because they do. It is an opportunity to explore different like groups of people, but at the same time, an opportunity to rely on one club for someone to feel comfortable. Like students should feel comfortable in the classroom, in the rec halls, like everywhere. But it's really hard to I don't, and another thing we talked about in the last episode, but we have to also remember, like, oftentimes we think of it as like a person of color and a white person, and not like mixed people. You know what I mean? Multi or
Yeah,
different ethnic backgrounds.
yeah. Yes, very much so. Um, like as you all were talking, I'm like, oh, I forgot I was going to talk about this one thing back in the slide. But I think something that just like came up for me, just like hearing you all talk, is like we were having a conversation in our training for RA selection, candidate selection sort of thing on Monday night, right? And so we watched this video by Melanie Funches, and she talks about how, and this ties back into like the perceptions slide way back at the beginning, about how she was at the hospital with her husband trying to figure out what's wrong with him, and the doctors were convinced that he had HIV/AIDS because he was a black man, right? And so they didn't test him for things that they would normally test white men for, and so she had to tell the doctors, like, no, you stop. You treat him for things that you check him for things that you check white men for. And so it's like that perception is like, again, going into that, we treat people how we see them. And then, like, oh gosh. So we treat people how we see them, and so like those perceptions aren't always helpful either. Like they can disservice others. Like the medical doctors were disservicing their patient by not checking for all the things that they could have checked for. And then also thinking about one of the RAs who shared like that MLK is like a holiday that, you know, cool. Sometimes you get to get out of class and do a project to learn about somebody important in history, right? Related to Black history or the Civil Rights Movement. And she said, we shouldn't only be focusing on it at this time of the year. You should always want to learn about it. And I think that's something that, like, when we're not thinking about all of the people that we serve on campus, because it's not just our white students, it's not just our Black students or friends or family members, it's not just our Latin students, it's not just our Asian students, it's not just any one group, right? And so we are always going to be in a place of disservice until we start having conversations and finding solutions. And so here's my solutions-basedness, right? And this is just some ideas that I came up with of like, what can we do to start educating more, or like thinking more about like the multiracial experience, but not even necessarily just that, but like in other areas of marginalization. And so like something that I had the opportunity to help plan and write for at my last institution was our Tunnel of Oppression event, which is also sometimes done as a Boxes and Walls, and it's like this large-scale event where you have information or scenarios based on different areas of marginalization, and people go through and they experience it. And so like then it ends with reflection and like what you learned about it, and it has like a lasting impression. But I think it's also important for us to have genuine curiosity about other people, right? Not just the population that I'm talking about, but to really get to know people and really care about getting to know people, because I mean, how can we serve people that we don't care about? And so like really leaning into those awkward conversations, because sometimes I know that they're awkward. But if we don't lean into the awkward, we're never gonna make any progress within ourselves and challenging ourselves to become better people. We're not gonna move past our biases if we don't lean into that awkwardness. And other people are gonna still remain, like, for lack of, to remain closeted or like shut in, right? Like shut in their identities and who they really are, because they don't feel like it's a safe place to share unless we start asking, like, hey, like, I'm genuinely curious about this. I think learning more about microaggressions, if you're not too aware of what those are, I think microaggressions are things that we unconsciously do or we don't necessarily realize. Like if we are saying that, oh man, I got gypped, right? If we don't know that gypped is short for gypsy, which is a derogatory term for the Romagen, that word, people, right? Oh, I should have prepared better for this. But then we're not going to change how we do things in the future, right? We're going to continually say things that can be hurtful to other people. And so, like, I think it's just important to do some digging and some, like, research and, like, being open to saying, oh, hey, I never thought about it in this context if somebody calls you out on it, right? So being open to that feedback. And so again, doing some research. Like if there's a population that you're like, I don't really know a whole lot about, but I'm working with a lot of this population right now. Do some research. Obviously, every experience is not going to match what you're researching, but I think it's still good to have like a foundation of knowledge. And then continue to ask more, right? And so I wanted to share, I went through our tunnel of oppression that I wrote my opening monologue for, and was able to sit in one of the reflection sessions. And I happened to be in the room with two other people that were of mixed ethnicity, one being half white and half Cuban, the other being half black and half Mexican. And so one of them said, while I was going through the race room, which is what I wrote for, I started thinking about my own experiences as a biracial person. I often get questions because my last name and my skin color do not match to people. And so how many times does that happen in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year? And what effect does that have on a person to be like, you're looking at them confused because you don't know what they are, because their names don't match, or what other assumptions you draw from that. And so at this time, I'll open it up for questions. If anybody does have any questions, this is my contact information. If you want to continue the conversation outside of today, I'm more than willing and happy to have follow-up conversations. As I said, passion area of mine. So, any questions? If you want to stay behind and ask me, oh.
So the loving.
Yes. Yeah, the loving family, yeah.
They have kids?
Yes.
How many added to the complexity of this whole thing that they're marrying and being recognized?
Yeah, I think they had about 4 kids. I have to do some more research on them myself. I was just like, oh, like I remember that from a class a while ago, and I was like, let me put this in. So I'm not like an expert on that, but yes, I do know that they do have children, but there is, yes, a movie on it. I have to watch it yet, but I'm like excited to watch it. If anybody has any other questions, you can ask them now or you can ask me later. But thank you for attending my presentation today.